All right, so let's turn real quick. We're going to go through some things, continue this vein of reading, strategies for reading the text and getting the most out of it, kind of our research strategies kind of section. We've gone through quite a few things. So I'm going to go through a few more, some more ideas. So one idea is when you run into certain things that you're not familiar with, particularly cultural elements, right? So there's a lot of things in the text that might not have anything to do with modern culture, things like that. And if we're not careful, we'll just read right over them. But these unfamiliar areas become important points to do a little bit of research. So let me give you an example of one. So let's go to 1 Kings chapter 6. And this is an example of something that you could read right over really quick, and you wouldn't even think twice about it. So 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. This is the discussion of Solomon building the temple. It says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. All right, so what?
Where are you?
1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. So probably nothing stood out to you particular in that text. What would be something in that text that would be an example of something that maybe you're not quite familiar with that you could look up? And I have one specific thing. I mean, there might be a couple things in here. I mean, every passage has a variety of things that you could look up. But we're talking about something from their culture that doesn't necessarily equate to our culture that we could look up in this passage. The month of Ziv, right?
The second one.
Right, so if you went and looked up Ziv as a Hebrew month, what month would it be? Well, see, this is where the clue is. This is not a Hebrew word. Ziv is not one of the Hebrew months, which is interesting. So if you looked that up and you went to something, I have a website, it's a Hebrew date converter that I use quite a bit. If you looked up Hebrew date converter, I think it's HebrewDateConverter.org or something like that. But if you looked it up, it's a website with 2 columns, and on the one column you put whatever English date you're wanting, and it will show you the Hebrew corresponding date. It's like if you put the day you're born, it'll show you what that day was on the Hebrew calendar, or vice versa. If you choose a date on the Hebrew calendar, it'll tell you what that date is on our calendar. But so anyway, so I went in there and I looked, and Ziv was not in there. So I did a little more research on that. And so it kind of begins to open up a particular story, so to speak. So if Ziv is not Hebrew, then Ziv is actually Phoenician. Ziv is a Phoenician month, right? So how could dating by the Phoenician calendar slip into all of this stuff that Solomon is doing, right? Because this is the passage.
He married a wife that was Phoenician.
Well,
he has so many wives.
There's a Phoenician connection. It's not who he married. Keeping in mind the context here, we're talking about the building of the temple, all of his building projects. And for some reason now they are starting to date these by Phoenician months instead of by Hebrew months. So I guess that begs the question, who built the temple?
Phoenician laborers?
Well, the Phoenicians were the masters of it, right? So the Hebrew people probably did the grunt work, the labor side of it, but the overseers were all Phoenician, right?
What exactly?
Phoenicia is north, and it would have been like Tyre, Sidon, those regions up through there. And so those would have been allies of because David was fighting, they had a common enemy of Syria. We talked last month that map with Hoboth, or Zoboth, Hamas, and all of those places that were controlled by the Syrians, and then David defeated the Syrians, and then out of that became allies with several of the people that the Syrians had oppressed. And so as he defeated the Syrians, released their vice grip, he ended up then becoming connected with several of the kind of regions around there, particularly Tyre and Sidon. So if you remember the story then of Solomon, as he's coming through, they're worried, right, about the change in power, because whenever a king would shift in that culture, the king had a lot of authority, and it wasn't like he just had to follow the old alliances. If he comes into power and decides that he doesn't want to be friends with a particular group, then everything could change. And so when kings shifted, there was often a lot of uncertainty, and then so a couple of things would happen. One hand, enemies would take the transition of power as an opportunity to attack, because maybe this guy is not going to be strong in battle, maybe he doesn't have a good following yet, those types of things. So as soon as a new king would come in, if there was anybody wanting to attack, that would be when they would do it. So either strong enemies on the side, or people that say David had subdued, maybe they want to rebel. Like, so if he had subdued Moab or something, and then Solomon steps into the throne, maybe Moab says, hey, this is the time we throw off Israel's control because they're shifting into a new nation. Or, say if they were allies with another nation and the new king steps in, he may not want to be allies. He may want to take over their land and not just be allies. You know, you never know. And so they sent people to Solomon to kind of feel him out, so to speak. And it's in that point that Solomon basically strikes a business deal with them, and then they realize, okay, the peace is going to continue, right? And so, yeah, Hiram was the king's name, and Hiram's son as well, and was friends with them. And so, basically, they were sending materials, and they were sending workers down to do the building, right? If you remember then later, in exchange, there were kind of two main things that were given in exchange. So during the building, Solomon is giving Hiram food, right? Which makes sense because they're in a northern region. They were a very wealthy area because they had a lot of trade because they were on the ocean, but not a lot of farmland. So what they're looking for is the wheat and the grain and that kind of stuff. And so Solomon's got plenty of that. Their builders were renowned for their skill. So kind of, and their woodworking. They had forests up there, right? And so they basically made an exchange where the Phoenicians sent down wood down the river and workers to oversee all of the building projects that Solomon was doing. And so many of Solomon's building projects took on a very Phoenician style because, I mean, they're the ones that were building it. So this is not, the temple would not have been particularly Hebrew architecture because they weren't the ones doing it, right? And so now David gave them the overall plan, I guess, and then, you know, and a lot of that was based on, you know, the tabernacle being the model for the temple. But there was a lot of changes that were made as well. Instead of a small bath, he created this giant sea and then had 10 smaller baths on carts. And then he had, he changed the dimensions of it. He had giant angels in there instead of the two over the ark. He had two giant ones made of gold that he put in there. So a lot of different elements as well, but the same basic idea came from the tabernacle, which, by the way, was not all that unique among other buildings. We'll probably go into that in a different lesson, but archaeologically, they've discovered a variety of temples that just about every nation had their own temple complex and most of them were the same basic dimensions as Solomon's temple, about 100 feet long and about 30 or 40 feet wide. So the sanctuary there at Calvary is the length of the temple on the inside, is the length of the temple, and it's only about, it's wider than what the temple would have been. So the temple would have been the length of the sanctuary in Calvary, about that same height that had high ceilings, and only about 35 feet wide, whereas that sanctuary is about 50 feet wide. So the whole temple, this wonder of the world there, would have fit inside the sanctuary there at Calvary, And so, yeah, and which is.
The way the disciples described it to Christ, it was magnificent.
Yeah. So, well, that's here. But then here's the other thing. If you remember the temple discussion, I think one of the reasons why people have such a massive image in their mind is because they're thinking of this Roman fortress foundation that was left, and extrapolating that out to the size of what this temple must have been, without realizing it's the small area in front at David's Ophel that was where the temples were historically at, which is a much smaller area, which fits with this entire thing, that even the Babylonian temple and the temple at Assyria were these same sizes. So I mean, we're talking world powers that all of them had this same. Even Egypt's temple was about the same size as that. So it was a very common size. And then the setup, I guess since we're talking about it, we'll go ahead and talk about it now. The setup was very similar. Almost all of these nations, so many of the smaller nations wouldn't have been able to afford to do this, but Solomon was beginning to approach the size, if you will, of some of these other world powers that we see later, like Egypt or Babylon or some of that. So he wasn't quite to what they were at. I think sometimes when we read the story of Solomon, it was so amazing in their time, and for them, for Israelites, it was such a wonderful blessing, and not just materially, but also for them to have peace finally and to have their own space. But when we start looking at the material side of it, without having anything to compare it to in other nations, it would almost seem like sometimes people say, oh, how could anybody have that much wealth and that kind of stuff? But actually, when we compare it to the other nations that were around, it's actually much smaller in terms of the amount of gold and things that Solomon had. His building projects were very comparable in size. In fact, there's a Phoenician temple that was very much like that, the Assyrian temples. And so the basic format of what they would do is they would have a temple complex, and then somewhere connected to it or right there also would be the king's house, would be somewhere in here. And particularly a lot of them then would wrap around this way interior chambers. So like say like a door here, and then you kind of come in here, and there's doors on the inside of this, like a hallway all the way around with doors from the inside or something. And particularly Solomon's section of this was 3 stories tall. And so this is what is described as the storehouses of the temple, right? So it talks about Solomon and different kings later bringing treasures into the storehouse of the temple. And then when kings would come in and invade, it says they would go in the temple and take out all of the treasure and things. So they're not necessarily talking about the holy place and the most holy place, although they might have taken that stuff out too. That wasn't the storage part. They weren't piling a bunch of junk inside of there. That was normally maintained for the religious service part of the temple. And then so they had built these areas here connected to it as well. And Solomon's was 3 stories, which was kind of unique. Most of the other ones, there was one in Egypt that was 2 stories, and then many of the other ones were just a single story. So Solomon's was pretty unique because it was 3 stories with internal stairways, it said. So like a hallway here in the middle, and then internal stairways that connected all 3 levels on the inside. So that's kind of how his was set up. And then these different rooms then were, you know, I'm sure they had a variety of uses, but for the most part they were storage, right? And so the way that nations worked back then is they didn't necessarily have banks, right? So this would be the centermost place in the city, the most protected area. It's right next to the king's house, probably some kind of smaller wall also going around this complex to separate it from the rest of the city. And then they would have then, through a series of porches and hallways, like maybe columns, porches and things, a few other buildings connected as well. And so they would make kind of like a royal kind of complex of 5 or 6, 7, 8 buildings kind of all connected with nice porches and things, which is exactly what we see Solomon doing. And so Solomon had a variety of halls. So when we think of these halls, one of them was called the Forest of Lebanon, is what he called it, because in Lebanon it had all these tall cedar trees and things like that. So he made a hall where, say, when you come in, this is the door, you kind of come in this way. There were, like, say, 3 rows maybe of giant columns on the inside, all the way down, right, of these massive columns. And so when you're walking in, think almost like the Parthenon in Greece, where it's got all of those columns, but it's open, and so you can kind of walk in and people would just mingle and talk around the bases of these columns and things like that. That's kind of what the Forest of Lebanon would have been like. And within this building here, which would have been one of these buildings in this complex, you've got these columns, and somehow on the columns and on the walls, Solomon, this is where he put all of the golden shields, right? Remember that? So he has 500 golden shields, 200 large ones, 300 smaller ones, which was also a very common thing in other places. They found those in Assyria, Phoenicia, I think even some down in Egypt. So that was a common thing to do, even down to the different sizes, the large shield and the small shield. Like that was something that was in other places too. And so you had this big area there with these giant columns. So people in an area like that maybe throw a dinner party or something in there. So that's kind of what we're looking at, is this kind of complex with some of these different buildings and things where he could do different functions. Then he had another hall, connected as well, that was the Hall of Judgment. And so in this, it wasn't like a mingling hall like this one was. It was more of a the throne room. Yeah, the Supreme Court. So that's where he had the throne with the ivory throne made of gold. Would have been in that hall. And so all of this is very very common for the day, if you will, of the larger nations. They all had something like this, which adds credibility to the biblical story, if you will. Not that we need it, but for other people that, without knowing what's going on in the world around it, it seems kind of almost too good to be true. And then all of a sudden you realize, well, that was pretty common for temple courts in Babylon or Assyria or Egypt, that they had a lot of wealth. And so the reason you would have all of this storage around the temple is because the wealth of the nation was often held by the king, right? And their wealth was physical things, gold, silver, stuff like that. And so they have some place to store it. So think of the temple as not just the place in the middle where the worship was going on, but it was also the storehouse, the bank, if you will. Even though they weren't doing loans and things, it is very much like the bank of the nation as well, was right there next to his house. And so they would keep all of the gold in these rooms. So when Babylon or somebody comes in, it says they took all of the treasures out of the temple. They're not just talking about like the ark and the golden lampstand, that kind of stuff. They mean they went through all of these rooms and took out storage of gold and jewels and things that had been accumulated.